Welcome to Compass Christian Church. As you can see, we're doing things a little bit differently this morning, and that's because my wife, she went away for an all-girls trip and to celebrate her birthday. I guess that's how it works when, after you've been married a long time. How I want to celebrate my birthday is get away from my husband. So she went away with my daughters and granddaughter, and that one of the presents that she got while she was away was COVID, along with my two daughters. Fortunately, my granddaughter didn't get it so far, and so we're grateful for that. But what I thought the responsible thing for me to do would be to isolate, since I've now have been exposed to the COVID virus. And I didn't want to run the risk of exposing any of you at the church with that. So, like I say, we're doing things a little bit differently today. But nevertheless, I hope that you'll be blessed by the message this morning. Let's go ahead, and I have a video that I'm going to play for us. And let's watch that at this time. What I'd like to do is just lead us in prayer at this time, and then we'll go ahead and get going with the worship service. So let's pray together. Father in heaven, we are grateful that we can spend some time in church and thinking about you, examining your word, and seeing how it applies to our lives. Lord, as I think about this topic that we'll be examining today, surviving a bitter betrayal, that so many folks that are watching have gone through something like that and are trying to find their way forward. And that's what I want to do, Lord, as we spend some time together, is to explore the tools and resources that we need in our lives to be able to work through difficult times like these. We're not exempt just because we're Christians. We're not exempt from experiencing hurt and betrayal, but we do have the hope and promise that you give us that we can work our way through that. So be with us today. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So one of the things that I'm going to be doing is since I am not only preaching the message, I'm also running all of the tech, and hopefully I'll be able to do that well. But please bear with me, because it can get pretty complicated after a while. But what we're talking about is surviving a bitter betrayal. And this is the story from our study in David's life of Absalom's revolt. Few make it through life without knowing betrayal. And sometimes that betrayal that we experience can be an extremely bitter betrayal, where we are betrayed by friends or family members, by loved ones, husbands or wives, co-workers, church members, church leaders, whatever it might be. And that can really kind of knock the wind right out of us. But I really believe that it's possible not only to survive that, but also to discover how life can be good again beyond betrayal. And so that's what we're talking about here today. And we'll see when we can gain some principles from that, from David's life. And so let's go ahead and we'll look at that. As you know, we've been going through David's life, and we're still working through that. We have a few more sessions to go on this, but we're really in the final stage of his life, Act 4, and a lot of the drama in Act 4 kind of centers around Absalom, who was the son of David's third wife, if I remember right. And so, and Absalom had a sister by the name of Tamar, and she will factor in a little bit as we go through our study. What I want to do is that we're going to be covering 3 Bible chapters, and because that's a lot of content for one message, I've summarized those 3 chapters, as well as we will take some selections from those, some selected readings from those. So let's read the summary first of all. Absalom, David's son, conspires to overthrow his father in chapter 15. He gains the support of many Israelites by winning their hearts and positioning himself as a fair judge. He then requests to go to Hebron under the pretense of fulfilling a vow, where he secretly declares himself king over his father David. David learns of Absalom's conspiracy and decides to flee Jerusalem to avoid bloodshed. His loyal followers, including Ittai the Gittite, join him in his escape. Ittai, as we'll see, was the commander of the 600 men that were loyal to David all throughout his wilderness wanderings there when he was a fugitive from Saul. So David also instructs Zadok the priest to carry the Ark of the Covenant back to the city. Zadok was a loyalist of David's. He comes out with the Ark of the Covenant to kind of travel with David, but David said, no, we're not going to do it that way. And so he sends him back. And so that signals that he trusts God's guidance. And that's an important idea to remember, is that when our world is falling apart around us, is that instead of panicking and making emotional decisions that are not going to honor God or even serve our own interests or the interests of others, is that we need to just settle down and get into the space of trusting God's guidance. Now, that can be particularly difficult when you've gone through a bitter betrayal, because when that happens, that tends to rock your world at the core. But you will be able to weather those storms in your life a lot better when you rest your life upon the firm foundation of God and His Word and His love for us and the truth of that. So let's read what we see here in this passage. We'll go back to the scriptures here for a moment. So when the people brought a case to the king for judgment, Absalom, he would intercept them and asked where in Israel they were from, and they would tell him their tribe. This was before his coup. And Absalom would say, well, you've got a really strong case here. It's too bad the king doesn't have anyone to hear it. I wish I were the judge. Is that he really was resentful that his dad didn't step in and execute judgment on Amnon, and that was Absalom's half-brother, for raping Tamar, who was Absalom's full sister. And David, although he was angry about that, he didn't do anything to punish Amnon. And as a result of that Absalom took things into his own hands. And I think that really kind of began this whole process of him thinking that he was justified in doing this. And so he was working his own agenda there to position himself in the place of overthrowing his own father. After 4 years, Absalom said to the king, so this had gone on for some time there in Jerusalem. And so Absalom says to the king that, let me go to Hebron to offer a sacrifice to the Lord there and fulfill a vow I made to him. All right, the king told him, go and fulfill your vow. So Absalom went to Hebron, but while he was there, he sent secret messengers to all the tribes of Israel to stir up a rebellion against the king. The conspiracy, we read there, gained momentum. So Absalom knew full well what he was up to, and that his goal was to overthrow his dad. Absalom felt justified, in this, and that's one of the things that we see when it comes to people who are seeking revenge or oftentimes take these types of matters in their own hands, is that they feel that they're doing the right thing even though they may be outside the will of God. Now, not always is that the case, sometimes people know that what they're doing is wrong, but they just do it anyway. But let's read on and see what we can learn here. So a messenger soon arrived in Jerusalem to tell David, all Israel has joined Absalom in a conspiracy against you. Then we must flee at once, or it will be too late, David urged his men. Hurry, if we get out of the city before Absalom arrives, both we and the city of Jerusalem will be spared from disaster. So Israel, or Jerusalem, was a little north of Hebron, and so David had at least enough of a head start to get out of Dodge while he could, and he acts quickly. One of the things that I like about, there's a lot of things about David that we find in the scriptures are really not exemplary, but David was a man who was able to keep his composure when things began unraveling. And I think that that's such an important trait to have when you're experiencing problems. Instead of reacting to your problems emotionally, is that we need to learn to respond to our problems rationally and make the best decisions that we can in those bad situations. So his advisor said that we are with you and do what you think is best. So the king and all of his household set out at once. He left no one behind except 10 of his concubines to look after the palace. And as we'll see, these women factor in an important way a little bit later. I don't specifically reference it, but I will try to make sure that I come back to that as we go along. So then in chapter 16, David flees. Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, meets him. And remember, Mephibosheth was Saul's grandson. It was Jonathan's son. And David had shown grace to Mephibosheth. And Ziba was his servant. Mephibosheth was crippled in both feet, and so he was disabled in that world at that time, which would be complicate people's lives even more than what it does today. But meanwhile, Shimei, a relative of Saul, so David flees. Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, meets him and supplies and claims that Mephibosheth has betrayed him. Meanwhile, Shimei, a relative of Saul, curses David as he passes by, throwing stones at him. David's men want to retaliate, but he forbids them, suggesting that Shimei's cursing may be part of God's plan. And so here, once again, we see that David isn't reacting in this situation, but he continues to walk through it rationally with full trust in God. And this isn't some sort of fatalism in how he's approaching this. This was really a settled habit that David had whenever he was faced with difficulties in his life. So David reaches Bahurim, where he receives further support. Absalom enters Jerusalem. So David is still, has a head start and is extending that his lead over Absalom. Absalom enters Jerusalem and is advised by Ahithophel, who gives him counsel on how to solidify his claim to the throne. And Ahithophel was David's advisor. And so what he does is he defects and goes over to Absalom's side. And the way that he advises Absalom to solidify his claim to the throne is to go up in full view where the concubines were. They had like an upper story on the roof of the house, and for him to go in and have sex with those women. And that would essentially, he's laying claim to the throne and all of the privileges that go with that. So Ahithophel betrays David and throws his lot in with Absalom. So when David had gone a little bit beyond the mount, so we're back to the scriptures now in 2 Samuel 16, beyond the summit of Mount of Olives, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, was waiting there for him. He had 2 donkeys loaded with 200 loaves of bread, 100 clusters of raisin, 100 bunches of summer fruit, and a wineskin full of wine. Well, what are these for? The king asked Ziba. And Ziba replied, the donkeys are for the king's people to ride on, and the bread and the summer fruit are for the young men to eat. The wine is for those who become exhausted in the wilderness. So Ziba comes along and supplies David with some of the supplies that he would need for the journey. Now, this seems like a kind thing to do, but I think that, as we'll see a little bit later on, that is pretty calculating on Ziba's part. And so let's just go ahead and, well, where is Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson? The king asked him. Well, he stayed in Jerusalem, Ziba said. Today, he stayed in Jerusalem. Ziba said, he said that today I will get back the kingdom of my grandfather Saul. I just want to comment about what Ziba says about Mephibosheth. And I'll just say this really briefly, is that there's a skill that I learned. You learn a lot of things as you go along in ministry, but there's one skill that I learned that has served me well in ministry, and that's just simply this, is that I'm not responsible for what people say I said. I'm responsible for what I say. And sometimes, you'd like to think that when you're around people that the things that you say will always be represented accurately, but that's not the case. And I kind of think, and I don't know for sure, I have a hunch that that's the case with Ziba and Mephibosheth. So let's go ahead here and we'll go on with our narrative, or at least we'll go on with our message here. And what I want to do is that, we've thrown out a lot of names, and I just want to simplify this a little bit for us here. And we got 2 teams here. We have Team David, yay, he's the guy that should be on the throne. And we have Team Absalom, boo, he's the guy who's trying to take over. And there are a number of other characters that we find here in the story. We got Ittai, who is a warrior and commander, and he's loyal to David. Hushai, who is David's advisor, and he ends up being a spy in Absalom's camp, or at least in Absalom's court. Zadok, the high priest, and Abiathar, the priest. And so those are some of the main players on Team David. On the other hand, over there with Team Absalom, is that we have Ahithophel. He was David's former advisor. And then we have Hushai. Hushai essentially is that he was David's advisor, and he remained loyal to David all throughout this. But he went back to Jerusalem on at David's request. which, by the way, was a pretty risky thing to do, to serve as a spy for David, and he was accepted into Absalom's inner circle. Then we have Shimei, who's a stone thrower at David, and we'll see how he factors in a little bit later. And then a lot of the Israelites, as we see there, that the conspiracy gains momentum, and the people were fooled by Absalom, and he was a charmer, and he was able to get the people to follow him. Then there's the whole question of Ziba and Mephibosheth. Where do they fit in? And I think that's a little questionable about where their allegiance really lies. And while it seems like Ziba is on Team David, but I think that maybe Ziba's the only team that he was on was Team Ziba. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. So let's begin to kind of unpack where we're at in this story so far, because there's just a whole lot of details with respect to this story, and sometimes it's easy to get lost in all of those details. I'm doing my best to keep it as clear and simple as possible. So let's go over here for a moment and look at this map, and we'll see what's going on. So 2 years after Amnon rapes Tamar, remember Tamar is Absalom's sister, he decides to take revenge on Amnon here at this Baal Hazor place, and he murders Amnon there. As a result of that, he flees to his grandfather's home territory up there in Geshur, and that Absalom stays in Geshur for 3 years. So now we're 5 years into the story, until Joab retrieves him under David's orders. Then he comes back to Jerusalem, and he lives in Jerusalem some time without ever seeing David, until finally the father and son are reconciled. And then after 4 years, and so let's see, we got 9 years now we're into the story, is that Absalom requests permission to go to Hebron to, quote unquote, make a sacrifice. And we know what he does there is that in Hebron, you can see that that's south of Jerusalem, is that Absalom revolts against his father, and the conspiracy gains momentum. As a result, David has to get out of Dodge, and he goes back to familiar territory, the wilderness, Mahanaim, and that, he had spent a number of years in the wilderness before, and so wilderness, he was no stranger to wilderness living and where all the best hideouts are, and so that's where he retreats to that area. So let's talk a little bit about how to survive a bitter betrayal, because this certainly is a bitter betrayal. This is a betrayal by a son against his father. Now, as I've said before many times, I've been preaching through this series, that this is not a message about Absalom and David. It's really about a message about you and whoever it is in your life whom you trusted and has hurt you as a result of that. And so we want to see some of the lessons that we can learn from that. And in order to do that, we have to consider the dynamics of betrayal. And you notice that early on in the process, Absalom is working his mojo and getting all of the people to think that he's wonderful and great, charming all of the people and saying that, hey, if I were the king, then you would get justice. And I think that that's really the thing that stuck in Absalom's craw the most with respect to his sister Tamar, is that David, who not only was Amnon's father, but he's also the king of the land, and as a result, he was to implement and uphold laws. That David didn't do anything other than get angry at Amnon, and so as a result, Absalom gets revenge. And typically, that betrayal comes from those who feel justified. That for whatever reason, there's been some sort of breakdown in the relationship, and they feel that it's completely okay for them to take the course of action that they've taken. I like this quote by Paul David Tripp. He says this: "When your sin is exposed, you will run toward confession and forgiveness, or self-righteousness and self-justification." And it just seems that Absalom kept leaning more and more into that position of self-righteousness and self-justification. That David didn't do anything to remedy this situation or remedy this wrong, and so it's okay for me to take things into my own hands. But revenge, let's kind of keep things in their proper perspective, is that Absalom, that was not the duty of Absalom to enact justice in that case. He stepped outside of the bounds of what was legal, and he did his own thing, and he murdered Amnon as a result. But he felt completely, and that's what we are talking about here, he felt completely justified in doing what he did. But also, typically, in the bitterest betrayal that we experience comes from people, from those whom I trust. And that's what we see here with Absalom. He was a guy, he was David's son, and he was beloved by David. And that he had stole the hearts of the people and got them to back him. And I like what this Fatima Bhutto says. She says, the thing with betrayal, it's always the people you love. Well, of course, that's not always the case, but many times that's the case. That is the people that you love, and the people which leaves you particularly vulnerable. And as a result, that's when the betrayal particularly hurts. As a result of that, we're talking here today about how to survive a bitter betrayal. And another point when it comes to that, we talked about the dynamics of betrayal, but now let's look at the realities of betrayal. And so when things started to come down, David doesn't spend any time reacting to this emotionally, but instead he responds to it rationally and works his way, kind of picks his way through the debris of what of how everything is crashing down around him in his life. And so what he did is that he realized that it's going to be pointless for me to stay here and try to fight off Absalom, and who knows how much chaos and bloodshed that would result, particularly since the people are behind him now. So what he does is that they set out all at once to leave Jerusalem, and he steps away from everything that was rightfully his. I want to say that one more time, is that at that time, David steps away from everything that was rightfully his. The palace, the authority, the status, the wealth and the privilege that went with being the king, the prestige, all of that, is that David he says, right now is not the right time for me to try to assert my claim with respect to these things. And that's one of the things that oftentimes I think that people, where they go astray when they've been betrayed, is that they react emotionally to it and they try to force the outcome that they're seeking. Now think about that for a moment. And sometimes when we've been betrayed, we try to force the outcome that we think is best instead of just trusting in God. And one thing that that I know from going through betrayal myself in my life, in my professional life, experiencing a very bitter betrayal, is that I will lose a lot in that process. And that's just the realities of it, that your life comes crashing down, and there's all sorts of kind of things that you're going to lose through this process. But one of the things that we have to remember, that God is still God, and He's able to bring us through these times, and He's still able to accomplish His good purposes in our lives, His loving and good purposes in our lives, even though He still allows people to have the freedom to do what they're going to do, including hurt us and hurt us profoundly. So we're going to lose a lot when we go through betrayal, but we'll also find that there are some who will stick by you. That's what we see with Ittai here, is that he was the commander of David's 600 warriors that traveled with David throughout the wilderness, and even helped David, served as his bodyguard within the palace. And Ittai says that, hey, I'm with you, David. I'm standing with you on this one. And it's always good to have a few people around you who will stick by you through those types of circumstances. And also, what we find is that through betrayal, there will be a certain number of people who will turn on us. Not just the betrayal, it's not just the betrayer, but those who throw their lot in with the betrayer. Now, as I said before, Mephibosheth or Ziba, that he seems to be, he seems to use this as an opportunity to be on Team Team Ziba. And what he does is he throws Mephibosheth under the bus and says, Mephibosheth thought that this would be a good time to get back what he lost under his grandfather Saul. And as we read the story later on, that was not the case. As we read the story later on, that, I think that what David ends up doing, by the way, in this particular situation, is that when Ziba comes, he says to Ziba, okay, you get all of Mephibosheth's property now. He says, that's what my ruling is on this. Later on, we find out that Mephibosheth pleads his case to David, and so David kind of like approaches it, I don't have enough time to sort out who's right and wrong on this, so let's just split it 50-50. And Ziba, you get the half, and Mephibosheth, you get half. However, Mephibosheth, here's the stipulation for you to keep your half. And we see as the narrative progresses that Mephibosheth decides to kind of like transgress those boundaries and paid a pretty heavy price for that. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Here's the point, and that's just simply this, is that through betrayal, others will turn on me. And if you remember about Mephibosheth, is that David had done an extraordinary kindness to him. He appointed him, he showed him a lot of grace and let him eat at the king's table. And so he was very kind to Mephibosheth. And as a result, at least at this stage in the game, he feels that Mephibosheth has joined in with the betrayal. So Friend or foe? Well, we just don't know with Ziba and Mephibosheth which side that they're really on. Like I say, I think that Ziba is probably more on Team Ziba than anybody else. But there are people that are going to throw their allegiance or their loyalty or their lot in with those who are seeking to do us dirty, and that's just the way it works, and that kind of like compounds the hurt when it comes to betrayal. That through betrayal, my enemies will probably take some swipes at me. It's one of the things that I discovered through that experience is that through betrayal, people feel emboldened to say things about you that they never would say to your face. And you just have to kind of step back from that. And I really do believe that I really believe that the key to getting beyond betrayal is to forgive everyone and anyone who has hurt you. That doesn't mean that you're reconciled with them. We've talked about that many times, how that you only reconcile with safe people. But still it stings because people that you thought were on your team, you come to find out that they really didn't, they weren't as good of friends as what you thought they might have been at that time. And so when we see Shimei in this situation, well, then he comes along and he begins to curse David along the way. Here's the scriptures that go along with this. This scene is always, I find, to be somewhat amusing, if it wasn't so tragic. As King David came to Bahurim, a man came out of the village cursing them. It was Shimei, son of Gera, from the same clan as Saul's family. He threw stones at the king and the king's officers. And remember, these guys, the king's officers are like SEAL Team 6. I'm not kidding you. These guys they knew how to kill, and that, and so he's throwing, and so did David for that matter, and throwing the stones at them, and he said, "Get out of here, you murderer, you scoundrel," he shouted at David. "The Lord is paying you back for all the bloodshed in Saul's clan. You stole his throne, and now the Lord has given it to your son Absalom. At last you will taste some of your own medicine, for you are a murderer." And so Abishai says, "Well, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? And let me go over and cut off his head." This was his response to it. And David says, "No," he says, "I'm not going to react." And here again, that's one of the things, it's easy to get in that frame of mind where you react rather than respond. And at least I have a clear conscience in my, when I went through this season of betrayal in my life, is that I always sought to respond and not react, because no good thing comes when you let your emotions get the best of you and you start to react to the hurt that you've experienced. Instead, you end up just hurting back, and just it becomes a big mess. And did I do it perfectly? That's for the Lord to judge. But I did do it at least as best as I could through that circumstance. So the king says, "Who asked your opinion, you sons of Zeruiah? If the Lord has told him to curse me, who are you to stop him?" And so David just takes it on the chin here. So again, we see that Shimei is one of the guys that line up on Team Absalom, and he has thrown in his lot. And again, after David comes back, he has a change of heart, but in the meantime, Shimei's all fired up, and he is against David big time. So finally, if I'm going to know how to survive a bitter betrayal, I have to consider my response, and that's what I've been talking about throughout this. I have to weigh my responses to these betrayals, and like we see with David, is that he realized that this was not the right time for him to fight for what was rightfully his. And so he makes some wise decisions on this. I like what this anonymous quote says: never make a permanent decision based on a temporary emotion, because David could have decided to fight, and I think he would have lost that fight, because he was horribly outnumbered at that stage in the game. Absalom had the momentum of the nation behind him. And if we're going to respond appropriately to betrayal, we need to stay humble and surrendered. Abishai is the guy who wanted to cut off Shimei's head for cursing David. And David says, hey, my own son's trying to kill me here. Let's don't lose sight of the bigger picture here. And so leave him alone. Maybe if the Lord has told him to curse me, and I'm just going to let him do it. And perhaps the Lord will see the wrongs that I'm suffering. And that's a good principle to adopt, is that just let the Lord fight your battles. Instead of feeling that you have to right every wrong that's done to you, is let the Lord fight your battles. And when you trust in him, he will vindicate you in his time and in his way. So third, when it comes to my response, is that I have to keep my wits about me. That and this is with respect to Hushai, is that David, remember, Hushai was David's advisor, and then David appoints him to be the spy in Absalom's inner circle. And then when Absalom is weighing out whether or not he should pursue David, Ahithophel, we see them over there, they're on Team Absalom, is that Ahithophel says, yeah, go after him right now before he has a chance to catch his breath. And Hushai says, no, you need to wait, because David is a seasoned veteran at all of this, and that right now he's already holed up somewhere where you're not going to find him, and you'd just be walking into a trap. But actually what Hushai was doing was buying time for David, and God blessed Hushai's advice over Ahithophel. Ahithophel was so tore up about that he went out and then killed himself as a result of that. But that brings me to the point where you just have to trust that God has this, and he's accomplishing his good purposes for your life, even though that there may be an Absalom in your life who's trying to ruin and wreck things for you. So finally, let's go ahead and we'll wrap this up and look at 2 Samuel 17. And we read here, this is the summary of it, that Ahithophel advises Absalom to pursue David immediately, but Hushai, a spy loyal to David, we've already talked about that, he counters this plan by suggesting that David is a fierce warrior and that he would be better to gather a larger army, and Absalom follows Hushai's advice. Meanwhile, David receives news of Absalom's plans, and he prepares for battle. Hushai sends word to David through the priest's sons, warning him to escape before it's too late, and David and his followers continue to prepare for the impending conflict. And like I say, God is working behind the scenes. You don't have to get everything nailed down for yourself. Is that just trust God through this process. And that brings us to our last point here, is that I need to trust my unknown future to a known God. And God is able to accomplish his good purposes for your life, and that there's nobody or no thing that is going to frustrate those. One of the greatest psalms, I just love this psalm because I love its context. And we see that your unfailing love, David says, is better than life. How I praise you. Well, what is its context? You notice in the heading that this is a psalm of David when he was in the wilderness of Judah, and he refers to himself as the king. David was not in the wilderness of Judah fleeing from Saul when David was king. The only time that the king was in the wilderness of Judah was when he was fleeing from Absalom. And let's kind of jump into David's head just to see a little bit some of his thoughts about this. "O God, you are my God. I earnestly search for you. My soul thirsts for you. My whole body longs for you in this parched and weary land where there is no water. I have seen you in the sanctuary and gazed upon your power and glory. Your unfailing love is better than life itself. How I praise you. I will praise you as long as I live, lifting up my hands to you in prayer." Oh, if we would just have that spirit when we're experiencing a bitter betrayal. You know, I can get through even the bitterest betrayal. How is that I will walk my painful journey with confidence in a good and loving God, and I will discover that life can be good again beyond betrayal. This is the time in our service when we observe communion, and communion is a time for us to remember that the great God of the universe, the creator of the heavens and the earth, that God the Son stepped down from glory into our world, the very world that he created, to bear the penalty for our sin so that we can be right with him. And so let's think about this as we partake of communion at this time. Let me pray. Lord Jesus, thank you for the sacrifice that you've made on our behalf. And help us through all of life's ups and downs to continue to ground our hope on you alone. We ask this in your name. Amen. So let's go ahead and we'll watch this video at this time. You know, I love what that video said, is that those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. And you know, when you've gone through a betrayal, it's easy to feel extraordinarily depleted. But when we hope in the Lord and we seek to walk with the Lord through that experience, is that they will mount up as with wings like an eagle. And so I just pray that that will be your experience through the challenging and difficult times of your life. I want to just say a few things before we wrap up here this morning. One is that it's your partnership that keeps our ministry going. So thank you for supporting the ministry of Compass. And you can do that online. You can do that at church. You can do that by text. Or you can do that by mail. And all of those methods of giving are there on the screen for you to see how you can participate in the ministry of our church. I want to remind you about a ministry that I am working on and it's been a very active one, and my daughter Karen has been helping me with that, and that's our Beyond Betrayal ministry on Facebook and also YouTube. But we're almost up to 400 people in that group now, just a couple shy of that. So, you might be the 400th person to like that page or that group on Facebook at beyondbetrayal.org. And we seek to post worthwhile content for you to help you to heal, grow, and recover from the betrayals in your life. And I like to say that it's for anyone who feels cheated by life, others, or God. And, that covers almost the whole spectrum there. I'd like to also give a brief shout out to friends and family here, and that includes Wayne and Carolyn. That I appreciate Wayne and Carolyn McKenzie for all the hard work that they do to put together our services for Sunday, getting the room ready to go, and helping out with various aspects of communion and the offering and greeting visitors and on and on. And of course, Wayne's involvement with Operation Christmas Child, and Wayne and Carolyn doing that. But then also I'd like to give a shout out to James and Danny French, that they are just two of the best workers that I have known, and they're always seeking to find ways to be of help, and I appreciate them. And of course, where would I be without Val Torres and Nikki and Val stepping up and operating the tech for us on Sundays. And of course, there's many others that I could mention, but we are running out of time. And so what I want to do is wrap this up here in just a moment, that we are going to be closing out with a song that I really enjoy, and so I hope that you're blessed by it too. And before we do that, let me just offer up a prayer for you folks. And now may the God who knows betrayal strengthen your heart and your spirit through the challenges that you face in your life when it comes to betrayal. And may you be comforted and strengthened. And may you learn to walk in faith and not to react in sin. And that you will seek to bring glory to God in your life through no matter what you face. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.